little quiet? All right. It's good to be here. I've got it at 9 o'clock right now, so we'll kick this thing off. So we have the full 45 for discussion this morning. We are picking up with Daniel 11. This morning, everything that I'm going to be quoting from, by intention, will be out of the ESV. I find that to be the most accurate and also easy to read. I think that's an interesting balance. But last week, we pretty much, if my Bible falls off the front here, just laugh, it's okay. We picked up, or we ended really at the beginning of chapter 11. And I'm not going to set us a goal. I'm just going to say we're going to get through what we get through. And I think we have some interesting points, and I'm sure you guys can educate me on Daniel chapter 11 as we go through it this morning. So Daniel chapter 11 really gets into what I find to be probably the most interesting chapter of the book. I really enjoy the story of Daniel and his compadres in their exile, but the prophetic detail of this chapter is astounding. And before we get into the detail of it, I often hear, well, Daniel is a historical account, and I would strongly refute that. It is not historical, like I could write about the Revolutionary War, and that would be a historical account. I am not there, and I'm certainly not there before it, speaking of it. This is a prophetic account that lines up with what we see as history now. That's a very important detail that people, I think, get backwards sometimes. Daniel isn't writing a history. He's writing about what's to come. And the only reason he's writing about what is to come is to show how God will use man's objects to his glory and to fulfill his will. The purpose of Daniel chapter 11 is not to point out who Alexander is. I don't care. It's to show what God is doing in the background. So we will talk about these different dynasties, the kingdoms, what's going on in the background, but or in the forefront. But really, what's important is what God is doing in the background. And I'll try not to lose that objective as we walk through this today. I think some compelling evidence, because we can't really have proof that Daniel is not historical and that it is prophetic, but I do think that there's a couple of points that you can use in your discussions or to strengthen your own faith about Daniel being prophetic. The king Belshazzar, which is written about in the book of Daniel, was the last king of Babylon. Daniel writes about this. But basically every other historian says it was Nabonidus. So that led to a lot of consternation when you look at the legitimacy of the book of Daniel. Not necessarily the whole biblical narrative, but Daniel specifically. And we'll talk about Esther later as well. But we were like, well, who's this Belshazzar guy? Did Daniel just make this guy up? Or maybe Daniel was just incorrect? That's not the case. Later on, the Nabonidus cylinder was discovered, which is kind of this scroll. It looks like a rolling pin, but it's got writing on all sides, all around the cylinder. And on it, it mentions Belshazzar being the final king of Babylon, which is fantastic for biblical evidence that until this was discovered, what do you know? The historical narrative lines up with the prophetic narrative and the historical narrative that Daniel includes in his book. That's pretty interesting to see when these things line up. When you find in the areas of like Sodom and Gomorrah large salt and sulfur deposits, it's like these things kind of line up. Just something to think about as you look through the book of Daniel. So I don't want to delay too long. We've spent 5 minutes on the book of Daniel being prophetic and the history of it lining up. Let's look at kind of the introduction to chapter 11. The chapter has a lot of very specific details, covering almost 400 years into the future. It doesn't go to Christ, but it goes about 400 years up, almost to the end of the pre-Anno Domini period. But we'll summarize some things. We'll go into detail on others as we walk through the verses. I have a few quotes from a few different commentaries. I have one commentary from your library, which I found exceptionally useful. I will quote from it occasionally. Bible study textbook printed by College Press. It's by a guy named Butler. But it was back there, and I found this very useful. It's got some great questions, so if you ever need to study these are very informative, and don't put it to where the Cavs can't get it. So I think that's pretty good. But I have a quote about the mindset of people who put this later than Daniel actually was. Though all of this is presented as if it was the future, the considered opinion of most scholars is that the writer was using an accepted literary form which would have deceived no one. The intention would be to show that the course of history was under God's direction, and so achieving his purposes. When the history becomes prophecy, the transition can be detected because events proved him wrong. But it was a revelation. It follows the preparation that you saw earlier in chapter 10. And this chapter chapter 11 really goes into the division of four kingdoms. We're only really going to look at two of them here, discounting Persia. Chapter 11, verse 1 says, "And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." Last week I brought up my concern with this as someone who just looks at the English language. And there were a lot of pronouns in this that I wanted to clarify here as you're reading through here. As for me, the me here is the angelic messenger, angel being messenger. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I, again the angel, stood up to confirm and strengthen him, him being Darius. So in the first year of his reign, I stood up to strengthen him. That is not to say that Darius was a instruction-following God believer. That is to say that he was being used, his kingdom was being used to further God's purposes and to allow Daniel to continue to serve and prophesy, as we're going to see. Starting in verse 2, I really think chapter 11, verse 1 should be in chapter 10, but no one asked me. So chapter 11, verse 2, we're going to read what is in the ESV a paragraph. "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against all the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdoms shall be plucked up and go to others besides these." All right, I have it as 9:09. I'll give y'all a couple of minutes to look over those verses, and then we'll discuss them. And I'm going to drink a cup of coffee. I'll give it about another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll start discussing. All right, so what do we think? Provide me some feedback on what you believe is going on in these verses that we just read.
Well, I was just going to say, I have to read what other people wrote to really figure it out myself. I'm not real familiar, but anyway, I was just going to say 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. That has to be after Darius, right? 3 kings after Darius?
Yes.
And then a 4th that starts mentioning.
Yes.
And that 4th one goes against Greece. So this...
Yeah. It lines up pretty well. It's kind of hard to balance it. I mean, we can place Daniel pretty firmly because we know when Jerusalem was sacked and when he was taken. But walking it and kind of pinning it between those 2 dates when somebody attacked Greece and that, you can get a pretty solid timeline here. The 4 kings, is anybody familiar with who these kings are? So there's been some dispute about the 4 kings, and hey, here's another error on behalf of Daniel, or God, if you want to look at it that way. But the kings, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. So this is, sometimes people are like, well, there's actually 5 kings in this period if you count Darius. But there's also, it's very clear when you're reading it, and I will tell you the truth, behold, 3 more kings. And then there's one who's kind of an illegitimate ruler who gets sacked basically almost immediately. So they're like, is he really a king? And that offs your number. But it's Darius, and then 3 more, and then the 4th. And then the 4th, anybody know who the 4th king is there, the final guy that we're talking about? It's correct. Where are you getting that name from?
Some notes that I had that I read.
Yes, so we can discuss Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is mentioned only in the book of Esther. So that is how we pinpoint where Esther takes place in history. But yes, you're correct. Do you have any other thoughts on the 4th king or anything that you would like to say? You look like you got something on your mind.
Well, no, I was just trying to read what I had written down because I wrote this down a couple of weeks ago. But, like Cambyses and Pseudo-Smyrnus and Darius were the other 3 is what I have.
Yes. Let me pull it up. I'm not going to try to say his name. Because I'm going to butcher it. So there's, oh my gosh, Kshayarsha is his other name. So Ahasuerus is never mentioned in the book of Daniel by that name. Like, I'm Sean, you can call me Edward, that's my middle name. They're synonymous. But what is mentioned more commonly, because neither one of those are well known, you've got Ahasuerus in Esther, you've got this guy, Mr. K, and Xerxes the First are all the same dude.
Oh, okay.
So Esther is married to Xerxes, but you also don't, that's the tie there. There's not a whole lot of extra biblical ties, not a lot, to Esther being real. But you've got a lot of ties to things that line up, kind of. So it's like, okay, this could fit in there, because there's not a whole lot that shows where Esther really was. But yeah, Xerxes, if anybody is familiar, he ruled from about 485 down to the 460 BCs or so. And yes, he did attack Greece. He's very pompous, and that's another thing. You look at the book of Esther. One, Esther's kind of coming in at the beginning of his reign, to my understanding, which is more around when he was so pompous. But yeah, he's the fourth king, strong, rich, and he opposes the realm of Greece. Not specifically Greece as a single king, but Greece as a group of city-states in the 400 BCs.
And he was defeated.
Yes, soundly, twice. The first event, we're familiar with the marathon. I'm not a fan of marathons, but that occurred upon his first invasion of Greece. He attacked the Athenians in the Battle of Salamis, the straits there. So if you ever go to Athens, it's like right there, and the harbor is right there where all this happened, and a bunch of Persians got schwacked, and Xerxes is like, well, I got to go home now, so he leaves. But he was a very pompous guy. In fact, he built a bridge across where Gallipoli is, and it collapsed. Poor engineering, I guess. And he had his minions take whips and whip the sea for not listening to him because it collapsed his bridge. It's like that's the kind of pride this guy had. So anyway, that's Xerxes. But the fourth shall be far richer. That's what the Bible says, correct? And stir up all against the realm of Greece. And then that's not an omission of Cyrus. It's because he looks to the future. Smerdis, king of Persia, was only there for about a year, and he's included in this list of three, and then the fourth will rise. Anything else beyond the fourth king who goes against Greece? So yeah, who's the mighty king who shall arise? Is that still talking about Xerxes? What do you think? Yeah, you think it's Alexander? Do you concur? You got a head nod back there or a head shake? Yes, that is our boy Alexander. So Alexander is the son of Philip of Macedon. Let's tie that together. Philippi, the book of Philippians, that is written to the church in the city that is named for the father of Alexander the Great. It's coming together. So this is all in the same geographic area. And yes, this next section, very short section, talks about Alexander the Great. Then a mighty king shall arise, correct, who shall rule with great dominion. What do you think they mean by great dominion? What does that conjure up in your mind? What's a synonym for that? Authority, sure. Yeah, the extent of power, which is correct. Alexander is known as Alexander the Little, right? No, he's Alexander the Great. Not because of only his accomplishments, but also because of the extent of those accomplishments. It's not one good thing in one spot. It's extraordinary accomplishment across a large span of time and places. And so we go, if anyone's, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but it is important for us as Christians to understand the world in which the text that we're studying occurred in. Alexander did go through what we would consider the Holy Land. So he starts west of where his dad's city is named, and he walks through, like Black Sea is right here, and he walks through and south of that, conquers Asia Minor, so where all the 7 churches are that John would write to or send the message of Revelation to. He goes through there, and then he cuts down through Turkey and Syria, Not that these places actually exist then, I'm just using them as geographic reference points. He cuts through along the coast of Canaan, goes through where Gaza is, and goes into Egypt. He conquers, he basically entirely successful to this point. And then he kind of lingers in Egypt, not a long time, but he lingers there a little while. He kind of circles around for a while, make sure he's got the place in the lower Nile region. So the Nile runs south to north. So he is basically hanging out in the northern part of Egypt. And then he crosses back at Memphis, not Tennessee, and heads up back through Israel, through what was Israel, because at this time Israel does not exist as a nation. Israel is just kind of a group of people they're still spread out everywhere. Jerusalem has been rebuilt or is in the process of being restored. There is a temple, and there are priests trying to fulfill God's will. We can talk about that a little bit more too. But he goes basically up back to Syria, like Damascus area, cuts east, and then goes over into the Persian Empire, where Persia really is, or was, and then cuts down, takes over Babylon, the city, goes east further to Susa, and then kind of goes over toward India, cuts around there, doesn't make it to India, cuts back, and then he dies. So that's kind of where he is. He died at 32 years old, so a short reign, cool guy, but Alexander the Great. And then he didn't really lay out a will, which is a pretty common mistake for young folks, but especially powerful ones. So that's Alexander the Great, and he's mentioned here in those few phrases. You got a comment?
I was just going to say that Alexander's legacy is just so important later to the spread of the gospel, because he's the one that spread Greek throughout the world. And the cities that he set up, most of them you can tell because they
got some
named
Greek to them.
Alexander something. They were still there. In fact, a lot of them were still there until late in what we would think of as our Middle Ages. And people in those areas still trace themselves back to the Greeks.
Well, that's true. And then you could drag back to Alexander. You can definitely drag it back to the two empires that we're going to talk about, the two kingdoms that come out of Alexander's split. His kingdom gets split 4 ways, but only 2 of them really apply, because what are we studying here? Are we studying Alexander the Great? We're studying how all this affects God's people and the Holy Land area. So we're not really going to talk about the other 4 parts or the other 2 parts, but we are going to talk about the 2 that affect Canaan, Jerusalem, the north and south kingdoms. The north and south kingdoms are not Israel and Judah when mentioned in Daniel chapter 11 also. That should be clarified. So, verse 4, as soon as he has arisen, he being this mighty king, Alexander the Great, his kingdom shall be broken. So, lickety split. He does his great stuff, and then he's done. He dies. I could be wrong. I think he dies of like pneumonia or some disease that arose after he had a binge drinking episode. So there's another reason not to do that. I could be wrong, and I don't mean to misspeak or speak ill of the dead, but I think that's what happened to him. And then his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, 4 ways, but not to his posterity. What does that mean? Not to his posterity. Yeah, not his kids. So Alexander had, I think 3 kids. One of them was born after he died. One of them was alive that he didn't claim, and then there was another one who I don't remember about, but he wasn't important enough to get the kingdom. I think he tried and failed, but not to his posterity. So Alexander the Great is pretty much done, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. What does that mean? Not to the authority through which he ruled. Yeah, Basically, they didn't have the firmness, the leadership ability that Alexander did. Because once again, Alexander wasn't a tyrant. He conquered these areas and said, "You're now Greek. Congrats." That's not the case with what's going on here in the north and south, in the east and the west for Alexander's former kingdom. They were simply lesser rulers. And then finally, I keep losing my spot. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. You're just saying his kingdom is getting scattered to these other 4 people who don't do as good a job. Any other comments about this section before we move on? Does that make sense? We've beat that horse enough? Okay, great. So Alexander is done, and it is now split. We'll talk about how it splits specifically in the next section. Verse 5 through 6. This is a run-on sentence, run-on verse. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall make a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. All right, I got it as 9:27. I'll give you a couple minutes. It's a lot of pronouns. Can be confusing. All right, everybody had enough time? Good. So, starting in verse 5, then the king of the south shall be strong. Who's the king of the south? Yes, Ptolemy. Basically, New Egypt. He's in charge of the south area, which is basically Israel and south. So he's not really, and this flips hands a lot. Israel's kind of the pivot point, but they go back and forth. So that's who they're talking about in verse 5. He shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule. What's that mean? Does that mean that, like, vice president is ruling over the president? Not so much. More like, you're out of here. I'm boss now. So that's Ptolemy, and as I understand it, Ptolemy II. He is king of the north. He's one of the splits. As I remember right, he is Alexander's general. Obviously very helpful in carrying out the orders and objectives of Alexander the Great. He takes 1/4 of Alexander's kingdom. Ptolemy takes another quarter. Seleucus takes basically Syria and Turkey. And then Ptolemy takes the Egypt area. And that's around 312 or so when Alexander dies. They split the kingdom. And then a few years later, Ptolemy II takes over, and that's when you get the guy for whom Antioch is named. Antiochus the first takes over for Seleucus. That's during the first Syrian war. And then that's all in verse 5. And his authority shall make a great authority. So basically, Ptolemy II is doing a good job, as I understand it. If I'm wrong, please forgive me. Verse 6. After some years, they shall make an alliance. Oh boy. And the daughter of the king of the south. Who's the king of the south? Ptolemy. So one of the Ptolemies. So you've got Ptolemy. You can say it's one of these. It's Ptolemy the second right now, potentially already becoming Ptolemy the third. After some years, they shall make an alliance. Buddy. Seleucus was succeeded by Antiochus, who was succeeded by Seleucus. This is still Antiochus. They make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, who is named Bernice, shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she, Bernice, shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. So Antiochus, his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, Bernice is given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and who supported her in those times. So it's like a bunch of poisoning and murdering back and forth. Not really important for us. It's just very specific prophecy. So that's what's going on. It's like it's just an alliance that goes south. And for that, they become buddies, and then they split apart. There's a lot of murdering and killing and new kings. Okay. Then that's basically the Second Syrian War. It's called the Syrian War because it's taken in that eastern Mediterranean cradle of civilization type area. And then you get the Third Syrian War. This is about 60 years after Alexander's dead, so things are not going well. You've already had 3 wars in that time. Bernice is with the northern kingdom now, and Ptolemy III is over Egypt. And then Bernice comes back and ends up dying. And then eventually Israel gets captured by the north again. It had traded hands, and so it's going back and forth and back and forth. And that's now Ptolemy IV, and then Ptolemy V, and Antiochus III, and Antiochus IV eventually, and the Sixth Syrian War. So there's a lot of back and forth. Not important. Not important at all. But it goes into play when it's very specific. In verse 6, not retain the strength of her arm, he and his arm shall be given up, her attendants too, her dad, and the one who sent her. So it's very specific in the detail, which leads back to our earlier concern of it, historical versus prophetic account. Any comments on this? It's kind of just, here's what's going to happen, and then it happens. And it's only pertaining to the Holy Land area. It's not really talking about what's going on elsewhere. It's talking about the interchanges and conflicts that are going on over and between Israel's old turf. Okay. Let's read verse 7, 8, and 9. And from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. All right, give you all a few. All right. So this is a continuation of the political and military mess that started after Alexander died. But from a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, in verse 7. And then that person comes with an army. So the branch of her roots is Ptolemy III. That's Ptolemy III, who was the brother of Bernice, who is part of the alliance earlier. And then Ptolemy III, his sister, so he's from the south. Remember, Ptolemy is from the south. But his sister is killed when her husband dies. And Ptolemy is still in Egypt. He goes up there and whoops Syria, says, that's what you get for killing my sister. And then this is Seleucus II, who the first was the prince who was mightier from the south. So Syria is kind of an offshoot of Egypt at this point, but Egypt goes up and deals with Syria again. It's kind of confusing because it's like this, guys need different names. But again, nobody asked me. But that continues for a longer period. Ptolemy III lives past Seleucus. He doesn't kill Seleucus when he goes up there. He just says, stop messing around. Any comment about that? Basically, that's what that covers, is the avenging of Bernice by Ptolemy II. Okay. We'll touch verse 10 here. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. All right. I've got us with like 5 minutes. I'm not going to fiddle around with reading it. We're just going to go through it together. The kings of the north and their armies basically end up winning over the north. However, his son shall stir up and shall prevail with his great multitude of forces. So Israel's reconquered again, which once again is kind of centering our focus on Israel being the focal point. That's why Daniel is being told about this. And it was kind of a buffer zone, kind of a demilitarized zone for a while. But where is it? Assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through. Seleucus and Antiochus, both the third, are both the sons of Seleucus II. And both were successful, and then Antiochus ends up taking the Holy Land back from Egypt. So Syria now owns Israel again. Oh, yeah. And then the king of the south, Ptolemy, again gets an upper hand, and it's true. He just raises a large army and goes up, and at the Battle of Raphia, defeats Antiochus III, who is again the son of the other guy, Seleucus. Because of that loss, Israel traded hands back again to Egypt. So there's at least 3 exchanges that I can track of the Holy Land turning back and forth. And Israel's kind of just in the middle of this, like, don't do me, don't hurt me. And then at the end, in verse 13, you start seeing, for the king of the north shall again raise a multitude, and after some years he comes through with a great army and abundant supplies. That's just another change of hands again. So now Syria has Israel again. That's at least exchange number 4 right there. So in like 3 verses, we've seen 3 flips. And then Judea is being flip-flopped back and forth and just getting absolutely laid waste every time because the armies are stripping it of supplies and food and everything that they need to sustain themselves. But that's the end of verse 13, and then that's kind of the end of that paragraph. Verse 14 says, "In those times many shall rise against the king of the south," so kind of insurrection, "and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail." What's that mean? Fulfill the vision. What vision are they talking about? All right. So basically, the Jews living in Judea helped Antiochus, who's up north. All the southern kingdoms are Ptolemies. The north goes back and forth between Seleucus and Antiochus. It's kind of helpful for remembering. But Egypt was really rude when they were rulers, kind of tyrannical. So Israel typically sided with the north, and the violence extended and welcomed the northern new captors as liberators against worse captors. Kind of the enemy of my enemy. The evil you know, I guess. But Antiochus eventually says, you know what, I don't like you either. And he goes through and he lays waste to the Holy Land again. So that's kind of the end of verse 16, back and forth. And this kind of leads you into the Maccabean world, which isn't in the Bible and isn't a biblical narrative. It's a true narrative, but it's not a biblical one. So that's kind of where we end up at the end of verse 16. There's some more stuff in here. The prophecy goes on and on. I mean, we've only covered a few years right there, but that's where it kind of leads to. You've got a lot of revolt. Israel's being turned back and forth between the Ptolemies and the Antiochus, for whom Antioch is named, and the Seleucus guys. So they're just battling back and forth. Israel's one or the other, and really they're just nobody's property at this point. They just kind of go back and forth. But all this to say, it's all focused on very specific detail that prove the validity of Daniel's prophecy, and then we get that historical narrative that lines up outside the Bible with what Daniel says. So you can have good confidence in this, and that the things that Daniel's prophesying that come true prove that Daniel's right, and Daniel's talking about serving the Lord, so we see that that must also be correct. Does that make sense? That's a logical train of thought. I have those occasionally. But that's kind of where you end up. That's the why behind all this, is that Daniel is correct through his prophecy, through the Lord, and that serving the Lord is right because Daniel is right. That's kind of how it all comes together. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. I don't see a purpose in continuing on just to press on. We'll hold the ground we got, like Alexander the Great. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.